There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Most people expect those moments to arrive with drama. Raised voices, slammed doors, broken plates, flashing alarms. Something loud enough to warn you that the world is about to shift under your feet. But the moment that shattered my marriage came quietly. Came in the form of a trembling phone call on a cold Thursday night. Not from my wife. Not from my best friend. But from the woman who wore his last name. Until that night, I thought my life was ordinary in the best possible way. I had a stable job, a house with a porch I'd fixed myself, a wife I believed cherished me, and a best friend who had stood beside me through every chapter of my adult life. We were the kind of men who grew up together, drifted apart occasionally, then snapped back into orbit like nothing had ever changed. Or so I thought. I remember stepping out onto the porch when the call came. The sky was dark, a heavy navy curtain with no stars. The kind of sky that feels like a warning, even if you don't know what for. She spoke softly, with a kind of panic laced through her breathing. She wasn't crying. Yet. But her voice had the fragile edge of someone holding back a dam. She told me she had found something. Something I needed to know. Something that would hurt me, but pretending it wasn't real would hurt worse. And then she told me the truth. Not just that my wife was cheating. Not just that it had been going on for months. But that the person she was cheating with was the man I trusted more than anyone. My best friend. My brother in everything except blood. When I heard his name connected to hers, something inside my chest turned cold. Not explosive anger. Not even sadness. Just cold. Empty. A kind of silence that swallowed every other emotion. I didn't ask for details. I didn't ask for proof. Her voice alone, the guilt, the nausea, the apology she kept trying to stifle, told me she wasn't lying. She wasn't calling to break us apart. She was calling because her own world had just imploded and she refused to drown alone in the truth. When the call ended, I stayed on the porch for a long moment, staring out at the quiet street. The night felt unreal, like the world had been replaced with a darker version of itself. The air tasted different, carrying a metallic sharpness I couldn't place. Inside the house, everything looked untouched. The lights were warm. The pictures were still on the walls. Her shoes were neatly placed by the door. Our wedding photo sat on the table near the stairs, smiling like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I walked inside and closed the door gently behind me. My wife was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone with the relaxed ease of someone whose conscience was clear, or at least deeply buried. She didn't look up when I entered the room. She didn't suspect anything. She didn't feel the shift that had just sliced through our life. I watched her for a few seconds. How peaceful she looked, how detached, how familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She was wearing the sweatshirt I'd bought her on our last trip. The sleeves were pushed up to her elbows. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she typed something into her phone. I wondered, without wanting to, who she was texting. I didn't confront her. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not the next week. People imagine that betrayal demands immediate action. That the moment you hear the truth, you explode, shout, storm out, throw accusations and evidence across the room. But betrayal doesn't always ignite rage. Sometimes it cracks you open in total silence, and what spills out is something heavier than anger. Confusion, grief, disbelief, a strange, almost paralyzing calm. For days I walked around with the truth in my pocket like a burning coal. I couldn't drop it, but I couldn't clutch it either. It just sat there, searing through the fabric of my life. I began watching the small things. The way she guarded her phone. The late nights she explained away as work. The shift in her tone when she mentioned him casually in group conversations. The excuses that sounded too rehearsed. The new softness she wore like a secret she wasn't ready to admit. I didn't need proof anymore. I just needed time to understand how long the lie had been living between us, to recognize the version of myself who had missed the signs, to prepare for the moment this truth would no longer fit inside me. And that moment came faster than I expected. Even though I hadn't confronted her yet, the truth began to seep into every corner of our life. Morning coffee tasted different. Shared meals felt strangely hollow. The bed we slept in together became a landscape divided by invisible fault lines. Every time I looked at her, I saw two versions of her layered on top of each other. The woman I had married, and the woman who had allowed my best friend into the space between us. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that comes from realizing the person you love didn't fall for someone new. They simply handed away the parts of you they promised to protect. The worst part wasn't imagining them together. The worst part was imagining how long she must have been gone before she finally left. Maybe that's what betrayal truly is. Not a sudden wound, but a slow departure disguised as love. Meanwhile, the friend I had once trusted with everything carried on like nothing had happened. He still texted me occasionally, casually, as if he hadn't crossed the line that defined our entire friendship. His messages felt like another layer of insult, ordinary words from someone living an extraordinary lie. I didn't answer most of them. I couldn't bring myself to pretend anymore. The shock eventually sharpened into clarity. I knew I had to speak, not to hurt her, not to punish her, but because silence was becoming its own kind of pain. Before confronting her, I called his wife again. She sounded exhausted, hollowed out, but strangely calmer than before. She had found more details, messages, photos, receipts, things that confirmed every suspicion. She said it wasn't just a fling. It was emotional, intentional, repeated. It was betrayal in its purest form. And she was living through her version of the same nightmare. We agreed to meet in person. Two wounded people sitting across from each other, trying to stitch sense into a story that had no logic. Only shadowed corners and lies folded into routine. She showed me the evidence she had found. I didn't react. The pain had already settled beneath my ribs. Nothing she could show me would surprise me anymore. But it still hurt, deeply, quietly, in a way that stripped away something fundamental inside me. On the drive home, my mind was quiet. Not numb, not chaotic, just hollowed out. The truth had gone from a whisper to a siren. Yet my emotions were muted by the sheer size of what I'd learned. I thought back to the early days of our marriage. The mornings she'd roll into me half asleep. The way she'd squeeze my hand when we crossed the street together. The laughter that came easily. The plans we made for the future. A younger version of me would never have imagined this ending. That earlier version of her probably wouldn't have either. Somewhere along the line, we had stopped being a team and started being two people performing the outline of a marriage. She didn't know I knew yet, but she could feel the distance. She sensed it in the way I moved, the way I watched her, the way my silence had changed shape. People sense when truth is coming for them, even liars, and she felt it. One evening, she came home with the same distracted energy she always carried after spending time at work. She walked past me with a casual greeting that felt more like habit than affection. I watched her remove her coat slowly, her shoulders tense, her breath unsteady. She felt something shifting. She felt me withdrawing. She felt the truth pressing through the walls. She didn't know how much I knew, but she knew something was slipping out of her control. She moved around the kitchen without looking directly at me. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for a glass of water. The air between us felt charged, not with anger, but with the static of an approaching storm. I realized then that this marriage had been over long before the affair. Long before the lies, long before the betrayal. It had ended in 1,000 small ways neither of us had acknowledged. This truth didn't break us. It revealed where we had already broken. I waited for the right moment, not out of strategy, but out of self-respect. I needed to confront her calmly, without rage, without losing myself in the chaos she'd created. I wanted my words to be steady, undeniable, and final. But before I could speak, something unexpected happened. My best friend's wife called me again. Her voice was different this time. Shaken, frantic, trembling with urgency. She had confronted her husband. There had been shouting, denial, truth spilling out in jagged pieces. And in the chaos, she had learned something she hadn't known before. They weren't planning to stop. They weren't regretting it. They weren't confused. They were planning a future together. A plan that involved leaving their marriages. A plan they had discussed quietly, privately. A plan they hadn't told us about because they weren't ready yet. My throat tightened as she spoke. Not with rage, just devastation layered with clarity. They had already envisioned the ending. We were just the last ones to know. I hung up the phone and walked into the living room. My wife looked at me, sensing something irreversible in my expression. Her eyes flickered with fear, guilt, recognition. An entire confession written without sound. For the first time since discovering the truth, I felt the weight of the moment settle into something steady and unshakable. The time for silence was over. The time for pretending was gone. This was no longer a wound I could hide. This was the moment everything would break open. And the man I was before betrayal would not be the man who confronted her now. This new version of me, hurt, steady, clear-eyed, was ready to end the story she had destroyed long before she realized I had found out. I had always imagined that if I ever had to confront someone I loved about betrayal, I would be shaking with rage, raising my voice, saying things I could never take back. I thought my emotions would drag me around like a storm, hurling words at random and hoping at least some of them landed where they were supposed to. Instead, when the moment finally came, I felt strangely calm. Not numb, not detached, just clear. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop resisting what you already know. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual. My wife moved around as if someone had dimmed the volume of the world but left the brightness turned all the way up. Every sound mattered. The clink of cutlery on plates, the soft closing of cabinet doors, the faint rustle of her clothes as she crossed the room. She knew something was coming. Her shoulders held a tension that betrayed her. Her gaze kept flickering in my direction and away again, as if she were measuring my silence and wondering what it meant. For days I had been carrying the truth like a loaded weight in my chest. Her affair with my best friend was no longer just suspicion or hearsay. It was fact, confirmed, described, detailed by the one person who had even more to lose than I did, his wife. Now I was done pretending. At some point between one room and another, between one shallow breath of hers and the next, I stepped into the space where she was and told her I knew. I told her I knew about the messages. I knew about the hidden meetings. I knew about the hours that had gone unaccounted for. I knew about the hotel receipts and the lies about late work. More than that, I knew about the planning. The whispered future she and my best friend had been building behind the backs of the two people who trusted them most. She froze. For a moment, she didn't blink. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown open like someone standing at the edge of an accident. Shock rolled across her features in slow motion. First denial, then fear, then a desperate search for any possible exit from the corner she had backed herself into. There were no exits left. She tried, at first, to grab at fragments of plausible explanations. A misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of what I had heard and seen. A friendship that had been taken out of context. I watched her throw thin layers of narrative over a truth that refused to stay hidden. And then I told her something she didn't know. That his wife had called me. That his wife had shown me everything. The pictures, the screenshots, the call logs, the careful timeline of the secret life they had constructed. Something in my wife's expression broke then. The performance stopped. The false confusion drained away. She wasn't dealing with a suspicious husband anymore. She was dealing with someone who knew, not guessed, not sensed, knew. Her shoulders sagged. Her gaze dropped. Her breath stuttered, shallow and uneven. In that instant, the woman standing in front of me wasn't my wife anymore. She was someone else entirely. Someone who had been living in my house wearing the face of the person I loved, but carrying a heart that had shifted loyalty long before this conversation. She admitted that it was true, not angrily, not defensively, more like someone finally letting go of an object that had grown too heavy to hold. There was no dramatic confession, no flood of apologies powerful enough to rewind anything. She explained that it had started small, that they had slipped into emotional closeness first, that they had talked, shared, confided, that lines had blurred slowly until there was no line left at all. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far, She said she had felt trapped, torn, confused. She said a lot of things that might have mattered months earlier, when the first cracks appeared. Now they felt like labels being applied to a building already in rubble. I listened, but I wasn't listening for excuses. I was listening to understand the size of the gap between who I thought she was and who she had chosen to be. She admitted she had thought about leaving. She admitted they had talked about a future together. She admitted she had been afraid to be the one to end our marriage outright, afraid of being the villain in the story, afraid of the fallout. So she had stayed. In my house, in my bed, living a half-life with me while feeding the other half to someone else. That was the part that cut the deepest. Not the fact that she had fallen for another man, but the fact that she kept me in the dark to make the landing softer for herself. She cried at some point. The tears came late, spilling over when the words ran out. They were real, but they weren't for the same version of us I was mourning. She wasn't grieving the loss of the marriage I had lived in. She was grieving the collapse of the double life she had been balancing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations like grenades. I didn't ask for graphic details that would haunt me later. I simply told her I was done. Not with yelling. Not with begging. With us. I told her I would not stand in the doorway of a life where I was second choice. I would not compete with someone who had once been my closest ally. I would not live in a home that had already been emotionally vacated. The decision didn't feel like revenge. It felt like self-respect. That night, she slept in the guest room. The closed door between our rooms was a physical barrier that matched the emotional distance that had been stretching for months. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of finality settle onto my chest like something almost solid. The marriage was over. The only thing left now was the process of ending it on paper. The next morning, the man who used to be my closest friend finally tried to reach me. His name flashed on my phone screen again and again. Calls. Messages. Short, panicked texts asking if we could talk. Messages that alternated between urgency and a forced lightness, as if he were trying to pull me back into the casual dynamic we had once shared. I let the calls ring out. I stared at the messages without responding. He had spoken enough behind my back. Now he could sit with his own silence. Eventually, I agreed to meet him, not because I wanted answers, but because I needed to look him in the eye one last time and officially sever a bond he had already cut. We met in a neutral place, somewhere public, but not too crowded. A parking lot edge near a park, where conversations could be held without walls listening. He looked smaller than I remembered. The easy confidence he used to wear like a second jacket was gone. His shoulders slumped with the weight of exposure. His eyes flicked between guilt and defensiveness, the way people look when they're still trying to decide which role to play. He tried to explain himself. He said it hadn't started with any intention to hurt me, that they had been supporting each other through hard times, that one thing had led to another, that he had been confused, unhappy, weak. He said he still valued our friendship. He said he had been planning to talk to me. He said he had gotten in too deep. Words, words, words. None of them could touch the core violation of what he had done. This wasn't just another man. This was the man who had stood next to me at my wedding. The man who had laughed with me over beers, shared secrets, talked about life, plans, fears. The man I had trusted with my worst days and my best ones. And he had chosen to step into my home, into my marriage, into my wife's heart as if my existence was a temporary inconvenience. I told him calmly that whatever he thought we had as friends was gone. I told him I would not carry his secrets anymore. I told him he had made his choice long before this conversation. I watched the realization register, the finality of it, the understanding that he had not only destroyed my marriage, but also set fire to the one friendship that had shaped most of his adult life. He tried to insist that he cared about her, that it wasn't just physical, that he had real feelings, that they had talked about leaving, rebuilding, starting over. He said it like it excused anything. Didn't. The meeting ended without drama. No punches thrown. No shouting in the parking lot. Just two men walking away in opposite directions, both knowing they would never stand side by side again. I didn't look back. If there was one unexpected ally in all of this, it was his wife. The woman who had called me that first night became the only person on earth who fully understood the shape of my pain. She knew what it felt like to be betrayed not only by a partner, but by the person we had both trusted as family. We talked more in the weeks that followed, not in a way that replaced what we had lost, but in a way that acknowledged it. We compared timelines, details, small inconsistencies that suddenly made sense. We pieced together how long this had been going on, filling in gaps neither of us had seen before. She had children with him. That made her burden heavier. She wasn't just ending a marriage. She was navigating how to protect her kids from the full blast of their father's choices. Watching her handle it with a mix of heartbreak and steel helped me find my own backbone. She refused to let her pain turn into pettiness. She drew boundaries. She made plans. She stood up for herself and her children with a quiet strength that humbled me. If she could face the mess he had made of their family with that much resolve, I had no excuse to fall apart. We never crossed any lines. We didn't lean on each other as replacements, as sometimes happens in stories like this. We respected the fact that we were both grieving, both raw, both too hurt to build anything healthy out of the ruins. We were not a new beginning for each other. We were simply witnesses. And sometimes a witness is what you need most when your reality has been rewritten. The practical side of the end came faster than I expected. I met with a lawyer, just as I had done in my head 100 times before actually booking the appointment. This time it wasn't hypothetical. This time there was no waver in my voice when I described why I was there. The lawyer listened, took notes, explained the options. The infidelity mattered to some degree, he said, but the most important thing was clarity. Division of property, accounts, debts. Thankfully, there were no kids in our marriage. That removed one devastating battlefield from the process. I provided what documentation I had. Screenshots, call records, the timeline shared by his wife. I didn't do it to punish my wife. I did it to ensure I wouldn't be blindsided in court by a rewritten version of events. Slowly, the emotional storm turned into paperwork. Petitions, declarations, proposals for division. It was surreal watching 11 years of shared life being broken into categories and lines. House, car, savings, furniture, the couch where we'd fallen asleep 100 times, the bed where we had once tried and failed to bring a child into the world, the photos on the walls, the rings. She didn't fight the process. When I told her I had spoken to a lawyer and was filing for divorce, she didn't scream or plead or bargain. She broke down quietly in the kitchen, one hand over her mouth, the other braced on the counter as if the news had knocked the air out of her. But underneath the shock, I could see something else in her eyes. Relief. She had been bracing for this. She had known, on some level, that this was the only direction left for us to walk. Her guilt would not have allowed her to be the one to initiate it. She couldn't stomach fully destroying the life she had built, even as she had been dismantling it piece by piece in secret. So I did it for both of us. In the weeks that followed, we became project managers of our own separation. Calm, efficient, detached. We went through the house with garbage bags and boxes, dividing our lives in a series of quiet afternoons. She took the things that mattered most to her. I kept what made sense. Some objects were easy to assign. Others triggered memories sharp enough to make my hands pause in midair. The mug she always used in the mornings. The blanket we had bought on our anniversary. The framed ticket stubs from the first concert we went to together. We made practical decisions about sentimental things, because sentimentality had already lost its place in our story. The day she left the house for the last time as my wife wasn't explosive. She didn't slam doors. She didn't leave a grand speech behind. She finished loading the last box into her car, closed the trunk, stood still for a moment by the driveway and looked up at the house. Then she got in and drove away. I watched her go, feeling a complex tangle of emotions, grief, anger, exhaustion, but above all, a strange, quiet sense of release. I hadn't lost her that day. I had lost her months, maybe years earlier. What I was losing now was the illusion that she had still been mine. My former best friend's life didn't escape impact either. His wife filed her own papers, drawing a line for the sake of herself and their kids. He tried to resist, then tried to negotiate, then settled into the same resigned pattern my wife had. He moved into a rental, the kind of temporary housing that smells like previous tenants and lost chances. He and my ex-wife tried to stand in the ruins and build the future they had fantasized about. I knew this not because I followed them, but because real life has a way of making itself known. Their relationship, without the secrecy and stolen moments, began to look different. The rush of forbidden affection turned into ordinary days. Two flawed people, now without shields, standing face to face with the consequences of what they had done. That part of the story wasn't fully mine to tell. But pieces of it reached me anyway, through mutual acquaintances, through small updates from his wife, through the way their names slowly stopped being mentioned together. What belonged fully to me was the space that opened in my own life. At first, it was terrifying. The quiet house, the half-empty closets, the evenings without her body in my peripheral vision. Then, slowly, it became something else. Possibility. I started focusing on myself in ways I hadn't in years. Not out of spite, not as some vengeance arc, but simply because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't pouring energy into holding together something that had already collapsed. I exercised more, cooked for myself, reconnected with old interests, reached out to friends who had existed outside the tight orbit of our couple life. Healing didn't come in some cinematic breakthrough. It arrived in small, almost unnoticeable upgrades. Waking up one morning and realizing my first thought wasn't about what they had done to me. Going a whole day without picturing them together. Feeling my chest unclench when I walked past the cafe where we all used to meet. The divorce papers eventually came through. My full legal separation from her arrived in the form of a few sheets of paper and a stamped envelope. I held it for a long moment, tracing the lines of my own signature, feeling the finality of it. I wasn't married anymore. She wasn't my wife. He wasn't my friend. That could have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, because endings aren't neat, and wounds don't close just because a judge signs off on a document. There was still one more chapter left in this story. One more confrontation, not with them, but with myself. And that last chapter started the day I saw them again when I wasn't expecting to. Life has a strange sense of timing. You can go months without seeing someone, and then one random afternoon the universe decides you're ready, long before you feel ready yourself. It happened on a quiet Sunday at the grocery store. I was reaching for a carton of eggs, thinking about nothing in particular, when I felt a sudden shift in the air behind me. Presence. Familiar in the worst way. Heavy enough to make the tiny hairs on my arms rise. I turned. They were standing at the end of the aisle. My ex-wife, my former best friend. Side by side, but not close. Not like a couple. More like two people sharing the same oxygen but not the same life. For a moment, none of us moved. The world shrank into something silent and slow. The shelves stretching tall and the fluorescent lights humming above us like distant insects. I took in the details automatically, because when a wound finally stops bleeding, you learn to examine it without flinching. She looked thinner. Not in a graceful way, but in a hollowed-out way. Like someone who'd been losing sleep and appetite in equal measure. Her hair was pulled back hastily. Her shoulders were curved inward, like she was bracing for a hit that had never stopped coming. He looked older. Not in years, but in expression. His usual easy arrogance was gone, replaced by something tight and strained. His posture lacked that careless confidence he used to carry. He stood like a man trying, and failing, to fit into the life he once imagined would save him. They didn't look like two people living out a great forbidden love. They looked like the aftermath. Seeing them didn't break me. It didn't burn. It didn't cut. It just confirmed what time had already taught me. The pain they caused me had ended. The pain they caused themselves had only begun. For a second, she opened her mouth slightly, as if she might say something. Not to ask for forgiveness, nothing that dramatic. Something smaller. A greeting. An apology. An attempt at normalcy. But she didn't speak. She closed her mouth. Her eyes lowered. It struck me then that she wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of the reflection of herself she saw in my face. The version of her she didn't want to remember. He shifted uncomfortably beside her, looking at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at me. And in that tiny, awkward fidget, I saw the truth. He wasn't standing next to the woman he stole. He was standing next to the consequences of his choices. People always assume closure comes from words. An apology, a final conversation, some moment of mutual understanding. But closure sometimes comes from silence. From seeing the people who hurt you and realizing you no longer live inside their choices. From understanding that their betrayal might have redirected your life, but it didn't define your future. After a few heavy seconds, I simply nodded. A small, polite acknowledgement, nothing more. Not forgiveness, not hatred, just recognition that we were strangers now. And I walked past them. No glare, no tension, no lingering glance, just a quiet step forward. As I walked away, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vengeance. I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I felt free. For the first time since the night I learned the truth, my chest felt light. Not empty light, as if something that had been sitting on me finally let go. When I stepped outside, the sun hit my face with the ease of early spring. Warm enough to hint at something new, cool enough to remind me I wasn't done growing yet. I stood there for a moment, feeling the breeze run through me like a reset. I realized then that the story wasn't about losing them. It was about finding myself. The version of me that loved deeply. The version of me that trusted honestly. The version of me who survived something that should have broken him, and didn't. Healing didn't come from understanding why they did it. Healing came from knowing their choices were never about my worth. Their betrayal spoke of their emptiness, not my inadequacy. And for the first time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't stuck in questions. I was grateful, strangely, quietly grateful. Because if they hadn't broken me, I never would have rebuilt myself the way I needed to. If they hadn't walked out of my life, I never would have discovered the parts of myself I had abandoned to keep a dying marriage alive. If they hadn't chosen each other in the dark, I never would have chosen myself in the light. As I walked to my car, I didn't look back. Not once. Their chapter in my life had ended. My story was finally mine again. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead didn't feel empty. It felt open, wide, bright, waiting. I didn't know where I was going next. But I knew this. I wasn't carrying them with me anymore.